At least 30 women fell victim to one of the most notorious serial killers in history. But did you know some escaped his clutches by mere seconds? Some of them were brutally raped, some had their skull fractured, some had almost permanently lost hearing. The only good thing was that they were not dead. Apart from that, everything was more of a nightmare. One woman jumped from a moving car, another woke up to find him standing over her, only to fight her way free. These survivors didn't just escape death, they exposed Bundy's terrifying tactics and helped bring him down. How did they outwit one of history's most manipulative killers? What horrifying details did they reveal about his attacks? And how close did they come to becoming just another missing person? Their stories are extremely disturbing, their survival miraculous. But one thing is certain. Without them, Ted Bundy might have never been caught. Are you daring enough to know about it? If yes, keep watching till the end. January 1978. Kathy Kleiner was just 20 years old, a beautiful college student at Florida State University, living in the Kappa sorority house in Tallahassee. Life was good. Classes, friends, the usual college buzz. The sorority house felt safe, like a second home. On the evening of January 14th, a usual day of that year, Kathy was going to study for a test. Her roommate Karen Chandler was also busy working on a sewing project. The house rang with the sounds of girls' chatter, weekend plans, gossiping, and laughter. The two roommates finally called it a night, never knowing what would be unleashed. Somewhere near midnight, their bedroom door was flung open with horrific force. A dark figure entered, and before Kathy could do anything, he raised something heavy, later found to be a chunk of oak firewood, and struck her face with it. The blow was vicious, and she ended up with deep cuts and fractures. Karen, awakened by the assault, hardly had time to shift before he attacked her as well, with the same vicious force. As Kathy was there, bleeding and confused, the man was getting ready to deliver another blow. Then, headlights. A vehicle turned into the drive, while a sorority girl came home from a late date, unknown to the fact that she had just saved two people's lives. The sudden light in the room scared him off. Frightened, the home invader ran away, disappearing into the darkness. In minutes, the house was in full-blown panic. Police sirens flashed outside as emergency workers burst in. Kathy was carried down from upstairs, her world spinning. Officers quickly moved in, securing the premises, interviewing witnesses. Later, investigators found that the attacker had entered through an open door, crept around the house unseen, and chosen his victims apparently at random. By morning, the whole campus was in shock. The assault on Kathy and Karen wasn't a lone event. There had been others. Just doors down at the Chi Omega sorority house, two women, Lisa Levy and Margaret Bowman, had been killed. They'd been beaten, strangled, and raped. Another of the survivors from the attack woke up in the hospital with no memory of what was done to her. Her jaw was wired together, her skull was cracked. She could hardly speak to grasp her sorrow. And then the horror went on. Hours afterward, on the other side of town, police arrived to answer another vicious beating. Cheryl Thomas, a dance major, who was in her duplex fighting for her life. The brutality was stunning, and the whole city was in terror. At first, investigators struggled to connect the dots. The attacks were savage, unlike the usual calculated kidnappings they had seen before. But then suddenly a call came in from Colorado. There was an escaped convict authorities should know about, a man named Ted Bundy. Before long, his name was connected to the atrocities in Tallahassee. What had appeared as spontaneous, unrelated attacks were now associated with one of the most notorious serial killers of all time. Cheryl Thomas never foresaw it. One moment she was home in her bedroom, and the next, she was struggling to survive. The assault left her battered, her skull broken in several areas, her shoulder dislocated, her jaw broken. Worst of all, she lost hearing in one ear permanently. She may not have survived if it were not for her neighbors, who overheard her cries and came to her help. Recovery was horrific. Her jaw had to be wired shut for weeks just to heal properly. While Cheryl and the other survivors were attempting to put their lives back together, the police were racing against the clock to find the person responsible. Sheriff Katsaris had a single important clue, a bite mark left on the bodies of Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy. It wasn't much, but it might be the difference between catching the attacker or not. While this was going on, fear took over Florida State University. Nobody felt safe any longer. Fraternities started to accompany women home at night. Guys were staying overnight in dorm lobbies to keep watch, and police presence doubled. But the worst part, they had no suspect. Anybody could be the monster hiding in the shadows. Then, just when things couldn't get any more desperate, a 12-year-old girl named Kimberly Leach disappeared from her school in Lake City. And when her body was also discovered near a park, it sealed everyone's worst fears. This wasn't ending. Weeks later in Pensacola, police struck something that changed everything. A 31-year-old man in a Volkswagen Beetle caught their eye. He was driving much too slowly, as if he didn't want to be seen. When the officers pulled him over, he attempted to cool it, claiming he was a law student at Florida State. But when they searched his vehicle, they came across stolen IDs and credit cards associated with Tallahassee. And the vehicle? Stolen in a location close to the Chi Omega sorority house. When they finally ran his actual identity, they realized who they had just approached: Theodore Robert Bundy. Bundy had been in hiding since breaking jail in late 1977. He was already a convicted killer of numerous victims out west. And now, his arrest in Florida tied him to the ghastly FSU attacks as well as the killing of Kimberly Leach. It turned out that he had been present in Tallahassee since early January, renting a room off campus. It was second nature to blend in. He was intelligent, charismatic, and had even gone to law school. He was also normal-looking. That was the most terrifying part. For survivors of him, it wasn't easy to move on. One of the Chi Omega victims, Karen Chandler, wouldn't be controlled by fear. She returned to the sorority house and vowed to reclaim her life. She didn't want to be treated like she was damaged. And Cheryl, who was a devoted dancer, was having trouble balancing due to her injuries. Never dancing again was unthinkable for her. But she would not let it be the end of her story. She relearned her body, regaining her strength gradually. In the meantime, Florida officials labored to ensure that Bundy would never be free again. The man who had brought terror to so many was now in custody, and this time there would be no flight. Thus, Cheryl gathered up her life and relocated to Texas, resolved to continue dancing. She secured a new university and continued with her ballet education, attempting to move on. Meanwhile, Kathy's journey went in a totally different direction. College was no longer an option for her. She married just 6 months after the attack. Her parents believed she needed someone to protect her, someone to ensure that she never awoke in the dead of night to an intruder. And perhaps they were correct. Kathy had accepted it, opting for security over uncertainty. But regardless of how hard they all attempted to get over it, Bundy's shadow cast a darkness over it all. Justice involved confronting him straight on, and the victims, as well as their loved ones, were going to see that he would never again have the opportunity to attack another woman. Meanwhile, the FBI and Florida law enforcement were closing in. They questioned Theodore Robert Bundy as the media swirled with non-stop coverage of his every step. Stories analyzed his actions, the increased security measures around him, and the likelihood of charging him with the Florida State University murders. But somehow, in the midst of all the hubbub, the voices of the victims tended to get lost. Police continued to dig, wondering why this attack differed so greatly from the typical Bundy modus operandi. His prior offenses were planned and deliberate, but this, it was careless, as if he had lost command of himself. They theorized Cheryl Thomas was his intended target. Witnesses recalled seeing a man who bore a great resemblance to Bundy on a bicycle drive by Cheryl's house several times. He was stalking her. But then something strange occurred. But before we reveal that gruesome truth, please make sure to subscribe to this channel and press the bell icon so you never miss our update. Basically, this will motivate us to do all our research work and bring you bone-chilling true crime content on this channel. Anyway, back to the topic. Bundy noticed that a man was repairing a stranded car directly in front of Cheryl's house. Perhaps that startled Bundy and caused him to change direction. Rather than killing Cheryl immediately, he targeted the Chi Omega sorority house. His spree there was interrupted. Something made him depart before he could complete what he had begun. But he wasn't finished. Several hours later, he returned to Cheryl's residence, broke in, and brutally attacked her. Specialists likened his actions to that of a predator in a state of frenzy, unable to contain himself. The evidence against him continued to build. An eyewitness, Nita Neary, a Chi Omega sorority sister, unintentionally dropped a key part of the puzzle. She had gotten home late from a date, sneaking in through the back door when she saw a man walking down the stairs. It was strange, men weren't even permitted up there. She barely glimpsed his face, but she saw him rush out the front door. Later, when the police placed Bundy in a lineup, she identified him. This locked his destiny even more than the bite mark. The investigators obtained a search warrant to compare the teeth of Bundy with the imprint on one of his victims. This was not standard procedure then, but this was one of the first such warrants issued in American history. Bundy, the self-proclaimed smartest guy in the room, attempted to resist. He insisted on a lawyer and complained about the entire system, but when they read him the warrant and explained they could use force if he didn't cooperate, he gave in. The impressions of his teeth were made, and 4 dental professionals examined them. Their verdict? A match made in heaven. With this, the prosecution got everything they needed. A Tallahassee grand jury officially charged Bundy 2 counts of burglary, 2 counts of first-degree murder, and 3 counts of attempted first-degree murder. The indictment was made public, copies distributed to the press, and this only fueled the media circus surrounding the case. Bundy, the narcissist that he was, determined that he would assist in defending himself. He took an active role, taking witness depositions himself, acting as if he were in charge. But the survivors no longer feared him. Kathy Kleiner, one of the women he attacked and survived, struggled hard to regain confidence. She went so far as to get a job at a lumber yard, forcing herself past her fears. And when she was ready, she entered that courtroom, faced Bundy face to face, and testified against him. She wasn't going to let him have anything else. By the time Ted Bundy's trial came around, the entire affair had reached its own full-blown media circus status. News outlets filled the courthouse with reporters, cameras snapped day and night, and every small detail made the front page. It was no longer just a trial, now it was a spectacle, one of the most viewed in history. Larry Simpson, the chief prosecutor, had the world on his shoulders. Bundy had already escaped in other states, and Florida was their last hope at ensuring he never walked free again. They needed to get this conviction. And then there were the miraculous survivors. Cheryl Thomas, Karen Chandler, and Kathy Kleiner testified, each of them reliving their nightmare before the courtroom. Cheryl discussed the raw violence of her assault, 5 skull fractures, innumerable bruises. She wanted the jury to know the type of beast they were confronting. Karen, however, would not even glance at Bundy. When asked if she could identify him, she had to confess that she never did see her assailant's face. That might have been trouble for the prosecution until Nita Neary testified. She was a sorority sister who just happened to notice a man leaving the Chi Omega house that morning. When they asked her in court if she could recognize him, she didn't even blink. She pointed directly at Bundy. Then the definitive kicker, the bite mark evidence. A forensic scientist had compared a mark made on one of the victims and in court laid over a picture of the bite, a mold of Bundy's teeth. It was a perfect fit. There was no question that Bundy was the perpetrator. But Bundy, the showman, played it cool. The jury wasn't fooled. It took them only 7 hours to reach a verdict, guilty on all charges. The judge didn't waste any time sending him to death row. For Karen, the timing of the sentencing was unsettling. It occurred on her birthday. She wasn't a person who took the death penalty lightly, but with Bundy, she was sure. If he ever got out, more women would die. But this was not the last of Bundy's run-ins with the law. He was subsequently convicted of abducting and murdering 12-year-old Kimberly Leach, and another death sentence was handed down. Many of the survivors believed that once the trial had concluded, the media circus would end. But if anything, Bundy's sick celebrity status increased. Even scheduled on death row, everyone was still fixated on him. Kathy Kleiner saw it firsthand. Instead of ignoring the hype, she leaned into it, reading books and watching documentaries about Bundy. She wanted to understand why the world seemed so fascinated with a man who had tried to kill her. 3 years later, Kathy gave birth to a son, Michael. She tried her best to lead a normal life for him, never mentioning her past. But children pay attention. One day, Michael noticed a scar on her cheek and asked what had occurred. Kathy explained simply, "A man broke into my house and hurt me." Michael didn't ask many questions thereafter. But even as a kid, he had an unspoken fear. A silent, unshakable need to shield his mom. In the 80s, when Ted Bundy was on death row in Florida, fighting with all his might against his convictions, Kathy was out there piecing her life back together. She divorced her husband, which wasn't simple, but she invested everything in raising her son, Michael. For 5 years, it was only the 2 of them, and they came very close to each other. Whatever had gone on with her, Kathy had no intention of letting that awful night define who she was. Then in 1987, life took a curveball, but a good one. An old friend from high school strolled back into her life, and just like that, her entire life changed. The bond was instant, profound, and just what she needed. When he learned about her history, he didn't leave her. He didn't feel sorry for her. He just held space for her, providing the kind of support that would make all the difference. Meanwhile, Bundy was out of ideas. With his appeals stalling, he finally opened up. He confessed to 30 murders, but being the game player that he was, he revealed just enough to attempt to gain additional time, but it didn't pay off. Finally, at 7 a.m., he was electrocuted in Florida's electric chair. Out front, mobs were excited, cheering and chanting for his execution. Kathy and her husband viewed the news at home. When they watched the white flag rise, indicating it was over, Kathy wept. Tears not for Bundy, but for the victims who never got to witness this day. Today, decades on, Kathy has discovered her voice, and she's telling her story not because she wishes to rehash the past, but because she knows how powerful survival stories are. For her, talking has been a means of reclaiming control, to ensure that what occurred to her is shared on her own terms. She hopes that by sharing, others who have experienced trauma can draw strength from knowing that healing is possible. She wants people to know that life can move forward even after the worst of it. For Karen and Cheryl, though, Bundy is ancient history. Cheryl in particular has made sure that night didn't define her. The moment she walked out of the hospital, she considered herself a survivor, not a victim. By the time Bundy was put to death, she had distanced herself entirely from his reputation. Instead, she constructed a life of achievement, earning a master's degree from Gallaudet University, working with the hearing impaired, and even dancing. She married, raised 2 children who became successful adults, and now has 3 grandchildren. After 4 decades of moving forward, Bundy is nothing more than a long-forgotten chapter in a book she stopped reading a long time ago. After more than 40 years, Kathy finally made her way back to Tallahassee. It wasn't just a casual visit. It was something she needed to do. She needed to personally thank former Sheriff Ken Katsaris, the individual who had been so instrumental during those bad times. Now, Ted Bundy's is one of the most infamous cases in American history, with estimates that his number of victims was over 100. But his victims and survivors have fought tirelessly to take away the spotlight from him. The victims, not Bundy, deserve the attention. His victims weren't mere victims of a crime article. They were daughters, sisters, and friends. They dreamed futures that were taken away, and their loved ones refused to forget. Though Bundy ultimately confessed to killing at least 30 people, most people think the actual number is significantly higher. But even with the ongoing interest in his crime, those who do not forget the victims understand what truly is important. The objective is not to keep speaking about him, it's remembering the people he killed. Don't you also agree? Share your views in the comments below. And while this was shocking and frightening tale of crime, this case is something that will make you realize how lonely someone can be even at their death. Because apart from mother, perhaps no one really cared for you. Subscribe to the channel for more. See you soon.